Nehru says history must be linked to a humane vision of the future and not used to arouse hatred, violence, and destruction. That's what an intellectual is all about. Not about going with the sheep, but being able to be different. Nehru, on the other hand, was very clear what a university should be. The reason why WhatsApp industry grows is not because historians haven't written about it. It is because the state has undertaken the task of demolishing, banning these books. That is why we are still not a Hindu Rashtra. Despite the ruling government having a majority in the center and claiming from the rooftops India is a Hindu Rashtra, we are not, for this reason. I must first thank the organizers of the book festival. It's probably the only book festival organized by an assembly anywhere in India or perhaps in the world. I think it's quite a record, and the people of Kerala need to be proud of the fact that their politicians think having a book festival is a good idea. From the part of the country that I come from, the cow belt, books are as far from politicians as you can imagine. So, congratulations. In fact, I'm so glad that my friends are here. Professor Sebastian, Professor James, Professor Gopan Nair, and some of them have heard me earlier, and they know that every time I speak in Kerala, I start by saying that I come from the most polluted city in the world, not only environmentally polluted, but politically polluted. So the moment you land in Trivandrum or any part of Kerala, you breathe fresh air. You know, it's clean air, environmentally, but more importantly, it's free air. You can talk freely still. It is not the case, I must remind you, in the rest of the country. And I don't think that the Malayalis can afford to be complacent about it, because you are a part of this country, and freedom is not divisible. If there is no freedom in other parts, then that unfreedom will take over here as well. So we must protect this space. You are very fortunate that you have this space. Please protect it. And if people like us can contribute in any way, I would be delighted. I was asked to talk on my life as an author and reader. I think it's very presumptuous of me to talk about my life. It's not all that great. My life as a reader or as a student, which led to my becoming an author, it's worth talking about a little bit. I was deeply influenced as an author by my life-changing experience in being a student at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. A university which, you know, the Indian state has decided to demolish with the entire use of state power that is possible. Almost in the same manner as Hitler demolished Frankfurt University. The reasons are the same. Frankfurt University was the most advanced university. The whole Frankfurt School in Marxism, for example, comes from the Frankfurt University. So Hitler made it a target. People like Peter Drucker, you must have heard of him. Peter Drucker was this management guru. He was teaching at Frankfurt. He had to leave and run away to the United States. Now, JNU is facing the same denouement. The reason, as I said, is that both these institutions produced intellectuals. Intellectuals who asked questions, who made it difficult for the state, and therefore they had to be destroyed. Nehru, on the other hand, was very clear what a university should be. I'm drawing from my book. I think that is the reason I'm here. I have this book called Nehru's India, past, present and future. I believe it is somewhere there in one of the halls. And I'll just quote what Nehru says a university should be. This is December 1947, when independent India is born, and he's looking at what universities must be. And he says, I'm quoting him, a university stands for humanism, for tolerance and reason, for the adventure of ideas and the search for truth. If universities discharge their duties adequately, then it is well with the nation and the people. Having said that, Nehru is as if he's anticipating the current situation. He goes on to say, but if the temple of learning itself becomes a home of narrow bigotry and petty prejudices, how then will a nation prosper and a people grow in stature? That is precisely what is happening to our universities. Not so perhaps in Kerala, but certainly in large parts of the country, universities have become the home of bigotry, of prejudice, of narrow objectives. I can speak for my university, where students were picked up, put in jail for asking questions, and they remain in jail. Omar Khalid is in jail. He was my direct student for 4 years, without trial, without a charge sheet, and the court just can't give him a date for a bail. I think more than 30 times the bail application has gone, and either the judge falls ill or the lawyer doesn't come or this, that, and the other. I mean, this is unbelievable. Another student of mine called Anirban Bhattacharya, a colleague of Omar Khalid, from the name you can make out, a Hindu and a Brahmin, he got bail. So when a name itself doesn't give you a bail, you can imagine what kind of narrow bigotry is being promoted. Faculty is intimidated in my university. Their pensions stopped. One of them died without a pension, and so on. And most perniciously, they are meddling with the content of what is taught in the university, the syllabi. The government is determining the syllabi of the university. Have you ever heard of this? Your most educated prime minister, who can't tell the difference between a radar, whether radar can go through a cloud or not, who can't tell the difference between, mythology and history, who thinks that Ganesh got his elephant snout through plastic surgery, or our vice president, mind you, who claims that Arjun got his arrow, had a nuclear-tipped arrow. He said it in an engineering fair when he was the governor of Bengal, giving trouble to the Bengal government. The result was he got promoted to becoming the vice president. I was fortunate to have been a student in JNU from its first batch in 1972, and what we were taught was, and the ideology with which the university was started was totally Nehruvian, that is, fiercely independent thought, independent of the colonial Western domination, independent of social and communal prejudices, and producing scholars who can stand against the current, however dominant it may be. That is, learning to be unpopular. That's the discussion I was having with you, young man. That's what an intellectual is all about. Not about going with the sheep, but being able to be different. If you are not going to be different in a university, where are you going to be different inside a political party? So as a result, the subjects that students chose for research were subjects which had something to do with whether they chose economy, polity, environment, various communities, caste, women, whatever subject they chose, it was chosen with the perspective that it must contribute to the upliftment of whatever you are trying to study. That is, it must be related to your people. the subjects were not chosen, as unfortunately they are chosen today, to ensure whether you will get admission abroad, or maybe a job abroad, or if nothing, at least a fellowship to go to a conference. People actually, in fact, after the last History Congress, a student came up to me and said, "Sir, can you tell me a subject I can choose which will help me go abroad?" So I said, "Go across the street. There are those coaching institutes. They will tell you." My job is not to tell you how to send you abroad. I have not opened a shop to send my children abroad. But shockingly, that is what is happening in large parts of the country. I will read out to you just a small part of my book where I talk about, not read out, but I'll focus on about Nehru and his approach to history. You see, Nehru was exceptional in two respects. Both as a scholar of the discipline, that is how history should be written, and as a practitioner of the discipline by writing history himself. And it is therefore not a surprise that easily the tallest historian, if not the tallest intellectual of the country today, Professor Irfan Habib, has the following thing to say about Nehru, about his three famous books: the autobiography, the glimpses of world history, and the discovery of India. And this is what Irfan Habib says: "These prison works invite comparison in both quantity and quality with the kind of writing that the iconic intellectual Antonio Gramsci produced as a communist prisoner in fascist Italy. There are true similarities in that both went to history to find answers to the questions raised in their mind as men of action." That is, they went to history in order to find solutions as a man of action towards the future. And he's being compared with Gramsci, who's recognized globally as one of the tallest intellectuals among philosophers, among economists. I mean, there is no two words about it. And, it's a late acceptance of Nehru, but an acceptance well worth recording. I'll just list to you 4 or 5 things that Nehru says about the discipline of history, and you will be shocked that he's saying this in the 1930s and 40s. And this is now all, the big scholars are now saying those things. He's saying the following. Number 1, about more than half a century before the subalterns even began to drink milk, So much before, he's saying the following. History ought to be practiced. How it ought to be practiced? We need to write, he says, a people's history. Not the history of kings and queens and battles and dates and stuff like that, with which everyone gets bored. No, this people's history idea is not what the subalterns created. I mean, Nehru is arguing it in the 1930s. And dozens of scholars in the country have followed that prescription. It's completely wrong to say that Indian scholars have not worked on people's history. Beginning from R.S. Sharma, whose first book is on the Dalit in ancient India. Correct me if I'm wrong, you're the ancient history expert here. Second, he says, it is only when we write the history of the people, I'm quoting him because I cannot repeat the language so beautifully. He says, it is only then that we really clothe the dry bones of history with life, flesh, and blood. Otherwise, it's just dry bones. Second thing, he says that we must keep the big picture always in mind as the backdrop. Whatever little thing you may be studying a tiny area, but it must be studied in the context of the big picture. Otherwise, it becomes just a detail which may interest you, but it has no relevance at all. Now, this is again, historiography tells you precisely this, that you have to have a theoretical structure, a big picture in mind before you enter the discipline. Number 3, he says, how history is global, or what is now fashionably called connected history. That is, you cannot study any one part of the world in the modern world with the rise of capitalism and the emergence of a world system which is not locating you in the global context. Again, he's saying it in the 30s and 40s. There is no historian in the world who doesn't agree with this. Global history now has become the latest fashion. Finally, no, two more things. He says historical writings must reach out to the common people, not just a group of fellow historians. We didn't have to wait for Dalrymple to tell us this. You know, Dalrymple has recently made this famous comment saying that the reason why WhatsApp industry grows is because historians don't write for the common people. He, the first one, has written for the common people. You know, I mean, it is absurd. You know, historians as tall as Romila Thapar wrote for class 6 students. Bipin Chandra for class 12, Satish Chandra for class 10. They write for NBT. They write for Penguin, you know. So it is not true that they have not written for common people. The reason why WhatsApp industry grows is not because historians haven't written about it. It is because the state has undertaken the task of demolishing, banning these books, removing them from school texts, and popularizing what in polite language can be called rubbish. Finally, and this is important, Nehru says history must be linked to a vision, to a humane vision of the future, and not used to arouse hatred, violence, and destruction, as it is being done today. All over the world, Turkey, Brazil, Hungary, Russia, India, people are going back to history in order to create a sense of hatred of one community or the other. You know, this whole business of trying to go under each mosque to find out whether there was a temple or not. You know, the intention is to arouse hatred. The intention is not to build a composite society. So Nehru is very clear about it. And this he is saying in 1948 to a Asian History Congress. He's saying the following. History, he's saying it just after the partition of the country. The bitterness that it caused, you know, about 500,000 people killed, 6 million refugees. You can imagine the bitterness. In that situation, Nehru says, history shows us both the binding and the disruptive forces. We must, he says, emphasize on the binding and constructive forces or the other. Historian can either emphasize the binding constructive forces or the disruptive breaking of forces. And he says historians must choose the former. And this is what he did himself, brilliantly. In The Discovery of India, which if any of you hasn't written, you must take an oath that you will. It's easily one of the best texts written about Indian history till to date. I mean, there are a lot of historians here, but show me another book which traces the history from the Indus Valley civilization right through Buddhism, Jainism, Akbar, Amir Khusro, to the 19th century, the British rule, to the present. There isn't another work. And just as a matter of interesting detail, he wrote it by hand in prison in 1940s. No computer, no typewriter. And that manuscript is available in what was once called the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. They've removed the name, obviously. But the manuscript is there. There is hardly a correction. So to write this fat 400-500 page book without hardly a correction, it takes an enormous mental capacity which he had. Now what does he do in the book? He does the opposite of what the colonial and the communal people do. The colonial and communal, I combine them because they are identical. The communal perspectives emerged from the colonial. It is the colonials who created the notion of Muslim atrocity first in the 19th century. which was taken up by the communalists. They try to focus on the traumas that were created in the past in order to create further trauma in the future. I'll just give one example. The destruction of the Somnath temple by Mahmud of Ghazni. There is no child who has not heard of it. Right? Mahmud of Ghazni, this Muslim invader, came and destroyed the Somnath temple. And in 1951, this is what K.M. Munshi says. For 1,000 years, Mahmud's destruction of the shrine has been burnt into the collective subconscious of the Hindu race as an unforgettable national disaster. So 1,000 years it has been burnt into your subconscious. You are claiming a historical memory of 1,000 years of hatred. Was it true? So that's what a historian's job is. So Ramila Thapar says, let me examine what happened to this destruction of the Somnath story. And she finds the following. Using a multiplicity of sources in various languages, she finds the following. That 100 years after the temple was destroyed, it was rebuilt by another Raja, king. And there is no mention of Mahmud of Ghazni. It is not even relevant who destroyed what, etc., etc. But more important, 250 years later, in the temple premises, a Muslim trader is given permission to build a mosque. And a mosque is built with the support of the priests, support of the local ruler, and the trading community. No objection, no trauma. The first time the question of Hindu trauma based on this Muslim invasion comes 900 years later. This is a 1,000-year-old story. It comes 900 years later in the British Parliament. They are the first one to raise this issue, saying that it caused huge trauma to the Hindus. That is not, our society was not divided. So that's why we need to go back into history and fight these false creations of memory of such and such being an oppressor, and what have you. Now you understand why our Prime Minister goes about saying 1,000 years of foreign rule. We grew up as students knowing of only 200 years of foreign rule. The 1,000 years of foreign rule means since Islam came, of course his history and geography both are wrong. Islam came when the Prophet was still alive to Kerala first. They came not as conquerors, they came as traders and all sorts of things that is well known. There was no trauma. So here again Nehru writes in great detail differentiating between pre-colonial empires and colonial empires. There was the Ashokan Empire, Mughal Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire. They are different from colonialism and colonial empires. Now this distinction is a distinction that scholars are making now, but Nehru is already talking about it in the 40s. Lastly, so that we have time for you to ask questions. By the way, Nehru had a very different understanding of Mahmud of Ghazni. He says, and he's not a historian, he says the following. He says, Ghazni was far more a warrior than a man of faith. That is, it is not Islam he is pushing. He's a king who's trying to capture some other kingdoms. And then he goes on to say, after all, he raised an army in India under a Hindu general called Tilak against his own co-religionists in Central Asia. So he raises an army under Tilak to fight other Muslim principalities in Central Asia. So issue is not Hindu-Muslim. In pre-modern times, this was routine. The destruction of each other's temples, etc., looting of their temples, etc. It's a very different ball game from colonial empires. Instead of raking up this false memory, the nationalist intelligentsia did exactly the opposite. They drew on the reality of Indian society and how it organically dealt with religious, caste, and other differences. This is not to say that there were no differences. There were, of course, differences. But they were dealing with them organically through the rise of new religions like Buddhism. After all, Buddhism does emerge as one of the issues is caste oppression by the Brahminical order. Jainism, Sikhism, and about 800-year-long Sufi and Bhakti tradition, which are fighting against caste, which are fighting against religious difference. So there was this process happening simultaneously in the country. So Nehru draws your attention to that. This process, of course, stopped with colonialism, but we'll come to that later. Nehru focused on two things. He focused on India's civilizational history, where he says there is an openness to reason and rationality, a questioning mind, an acceptance of multiple truths. Buddha talks of 1,000 truths. When a disciple goes to him and says, tell me, my Lord, what is truth? Is this the truth? He said there are 1,000 truths. So this notion of multiple truths, that is what the country is about. You have one God, I have another one, he has third one. The fourth one worships a tree, the fifth one worships a stone. The sixth one worships a guru with his hair going up like that. Another one, the various signs, huh? And the other one worships a guru with no hair at all, the other sign, And nobody fights with each other for that reason. This multiplicity and the ability to live with difference is something which comes from the ancient past. Amartya Sen made this idea very popular in his book, The Argumentative Indian, and even more profound book called The Idea of Justice, where he argues that democracy could come into India partly because this question is asked all over. How come that only India among the third world is a democracy? He says you can link it back to your ancient tradition. Amartya Sen says that if you look at Sanskrit and compare it with other classical texts like Greek, Latin, Hebrew, you find there is far more questioning, far more debate. In Banaras, Nehru points out, the teaching was done like this. A classroom is collected, you sit down across a table or on the floor, and what do? You do tark, argument. So this argumentative tradition, even in the original hymn of the Rig Veda, there is the notion that maybe there is God, something superior. And simultaneously in the same, it says, but maybe there is not. See this duality. This is the beauty of the Indian civilization. Rather than this monolithic, hate-driven notion that I have all the truth, and those who don't have my truth off with their heads. It's a that is not the Indian civilization. That is why we are still not a Hindu Rashtra. Despite the ruling government having a majority in the center and claiming from the rooftops India is a Hindu Rashtra, we are not, for this reason. So what Nehru does is that he draws from the Indus Valley civilization, as I said, the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Gita, Buddha, Ashok, Alauddin Khilji, Amir Khusro, Akbar, Vivekanand, to show the same tradition. He points out this very interesting thing. He says there are songs written by Amir Khusro 600 years ago, which are sung across the Indian subcontinent. In Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in India, it was written in a dialect of Hindi, the Awadhi dialect. It's sung across. Chap tilak mitai re tose naina milai ke. Many of you may have heard this. It's sung across. So he says there is no example in history where this can happen. But that is it. And he points to that. And that leads to his famous statement. He says, from the Indus Valley civilization 5,000 years ago to the Dravidian, Aryan, Central Asian, Iranian, Greek, Parthian, Bactrian, Scythian, Hun, Arab, Turk, early Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Afghan, and Mughals. He said they all left their influences on the making of the Indian civilization. And now the famous line, like some ancient palimpsest. Palimpsest is like a manuscript written on ancient sort of paper, on which layer upon layer of thought and reverie had been inscribed. And yet, no succeeding layer has completely hidden or erased what was written on it previously. Beautifully expressing the idea that each one left their influence, got molded, and got created into a synthesis which was superior to the previous layer. It is to this organic process through which the Indian people had learned to negotiate difference of religion, language, caste, that colonialism came as a shock. As the famous African revolutionary Amilcar Cabral, who was murdered by the CIA, as he argued that colonialism, like the seizing, CEAS, the seizing of history of that period. So as if Indian history just stopped. This process that Nehru is describing just stopped. And what colonialism did was to freeze our differences. The organic process was to find a way of negotiating it. That process was frozen and exacerbated, increased. And the biggest tool the colonial power had in their hands to do that were the communal parties. They became the instruments for freezing differences, creating differences, imagining differences, like the one I just told you, memories which did not exist, so that you could create more difference. The world has learnt, and I'll end with this, to its very heavy cost, that the longest lasting legacy of colonialism is not that it left an economy devastated, which it did, nor is it that the political power was completely taken away. All that has been repaired. The longest lasting legacy of colonialism, beginning from Ireland, the oldest colony, to what is happening in Palestine today, is that colonialism left the people divided. Wherever they have gone, they've left the people divided. And the biggest challenge that India faces today is not economic and political, is that we have a divided people. And that division is being exploited by the communalists. And the way to fight that, I think Nehru and our leaders of the national movement have a lot to offer. And that is what I tried to do in this book. Thank you so much.